The people who change your life rarely arrive with a warning. Sometimes they arrive with an invitation. The office was almost empty when I glanced at the clock and realized it was already 10:07 p.m. Most of the lights on the 32nd floor had been turned off hours ago. Only a few desk lamps remained, casting long shadows across rows of expensive workstations. My desk was one of them. I rubbed my eyes and returned to the quarterly reports spread across my screen. Being the personal assistant to Damian Moretti was not a 9-to-5 job. It was more like being permanently on call for one of the most powerful men in New York. Not that I complained. The job had helped me pay off student loans, support my mother, and build a life I never thought possible. Still, some nights felt longer than others. I was finishing the final email when I heard footsteps approaching from the far end of the executive corridor. Calm, measured, confident. I did not need to look up to know who it was. Damian Moretti had a way of changing the atmosphere of a room simply by entering it. He stopped beside my desk. I lifted my eyes from the monitor. He looked exactly as intimidating as he always did. Tailored black suit, sharp jawline, blue-gray eyes that seemed to notice everything. Even with the sleeves of his shirt covering most of the tattoos that marked his skin, there was no mistaking the quiet power he carried. "You are still here," he said. "So are you." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. That alone was unusual. Damian rarely smiled. Fair point. He placed a black envelope on my desk. I stared at it. "What is this?" "An invitation." I frowned. "For whom?" "For you." That made even less sense. I picked up the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a cream-colored card embossed with silver lettering. Black Rose Gala. Saturday night. One of the most exclusive charity events in the city. My eyes widened. There must be a mistake. There is not. I looked back at him. "Why would I be invited to this?" "Because you are attending with me." I actually laughed. It slipped out before I could stop it. "You are serious?" "Completely." I set the invitation down. "Mr. Moretti, I organize your calendar. I am not the kind of person who goes to events like this." "That is where you are wrong." His answer came immediately. No hesitation. No doubt. I blinked. "People like Victoria Hayes and the rest of Manhattan's elite will be there." "I know. I do not belong in that world." Damian's gaze never left mine. For a moment, the entire office seemed to disappear. "Emily," he said quietly, "you belong in more places than you realize." My chest tightened unexpectedly. I looked away first. The silence stretched between us. Then he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and stepped back. "Be ready at 7. "What if I say no?" Another rare smile appeared. "You will not." Before I could answer, he turned and walked toward the elevators. I watched him leave, then looked down at the invitation resting in my hands. At the time, I thought it was simply a party. I had no idea that one invitation was about to change the way an entire room saw me. More importantly, it was about to change the way I saw myself. I spent the entire drive home staring at the invitation resting on the passenger seat of my car. Every time I glanced at it, I became more convinced Damian had made some kind of mistake. The Black Rose Gala was the kind of event people read about in magazines. Billionaires, politicians, celebrities, and industry leaders attended every year. Meanwhile, I spent most of my mornings answering emails and making sure my boss remembered to eat lunch. Those two worlds were not supposed to overlap. By the next morning, the entire situation felt slightly ridiculous, at least until I walked into the office. The moment I stepped off the elevator, I noticed people looking at me differently. Not openly, not directly, but enough to make me uncomfortable. Conversations stopped when I passed. A few employees lowered their voices. Others exchanged knowing glances. I reached my desk and found my friend Sarah already waiting there. She leaned forward immediately. "Please tell me the rumors are not true." I frowned. "Which rumors?" Her eyes widened. "Oh my God, they are true." "Sarah." She lowered her voice dramatically. "The gala." My stomach dropped. "How does everyone know about that?" "Because nobody has stopped talking about it since 8 this morning." "Wonderful. Exactly what I needed. It is not a big deal." Sarah laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. "Emily, the most powerful man in this building personally invited you to the biggest event of the year. As his assistant. Nobody believes that." I closed my eyes. Of course they did not. Before I could answer, 2 women from accounting walked past my desk. One of them smiled politely. The other barely bothered to hide her amusement. "See you at the gala," she said. The tone made it clear she expected me to embarrass myself. The moment they disappeared around the corner, Sarah shook her head. Ignore them. I tried. I really did. But the whispers followed me all day. By noon, I had overheard enough comments to understand exactly what people thought. They believed I was lucky. That was the word they kept using. Lucky. Lucky to have Damien's attention. Lucky to have the invitation. Lucky to be included in a world above my station. Not one person mentioned the years I had spent helping build projects behind the scenes. Not one person mentioned the 14-hour workdays, or the weekends, or the countless problems I had solved before they became disasters. Apparently, none of that mattered. Around 6 o'clock that evening, I was reviewing financial schedules when Damien stepped into my office. He immediately noticed my expression. Something is bothering you. I looked up. Everyone thinks I am going because you feel sorry for me. Silence followed. Then Damien slowly set a folder on my desk. Do you know why I hired you? Because your previous assistant quit. A rare smile appeared. Wrong answer. I blinked. Then why? His blue-gray eyes met mine. Because you were the smartest person in the room. The words caught me completely off guard. Before I could respond, he continued toward the elevator. One day, he said calmly, everyone else will figure that out too. I spent the rest of the week trying to forget Damien's words. It was impossible. Every time I sat down at my desk, every time I opened a spreadsheet or answered an email, I heard the same sentence replaying in my head. You were the smartest person in the room. Nobody had ever described me that way before. Reliable? Sure. Hardworking? Definitely. Organized? Constantly. But smart enough to stand beside people like Damien Moretti? That felt ridiculous. By Friday afternoon, the office had entered full gala mode. Designers delivered garment bags. Event planners filled conference rooms. Luxury car services called every hour. Everyone seemed excited except me. I was buried beneath a mountain of schedules when Damien's office door opened. Emily. I looked up. Yes. Come with me. Where? Conference room 7. That was all he said before walking away. Curious, I followed him down the hallway. The moment we entered the room, I froze. 3 executives were already seated around the table. Men who managed divisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Their expressions ranged from frustrated to exhausted. Financial reports covered the table. Charts filled a large presentation screen. One of the executives sighed heavily. We have reviewed every option. Another nodded. Nothing works. Damien sat at the head of the table. That is not entirely true. He looked directly at me. Take a seat. My stomach tightened. I think there has been a misunderstanding. Sit. Reluctantly, I obeyed. One executive looked confused. Another seemed annoyed. Damien ignored both reactions. Explained the logistics problem. For the next 10 minutes, they outlined a complicated issue involving international shipping contracts and distribution delays. The numbers were overwhelming. The conversation moved quickly. Yet as I listened, something felt familiar. I had reviewed similar reports months earlier while organizing archived project files. A possible solution slowly formed in my mind. I tried not to say anything. Unfortunately, Damien noticed. You have an idea? Every eye in the room turned toward me. Not really. Emily. I sighed. There was no escaping. Maybe. Damien leaned back. Go ahead. The executives exchanged skeptical glances. I understood why. To them, I was an assistant sitting among senior leadership. But the numbers told a story, and stories made sense to me. I stood and walked toward the presentation screen. Then I explained. One contract, one supplier, one overlooked route that would eliminate the delays entirely. At first, the room remained silent. Then one executive grabbed a calculator. Another reviewed the reports. 5 minutes later, all 3 were staring at me. That would work, one finally admitted. It actually solves everything. Another executive shook his head in disbelief. How did nobody see this? Damien's expression never changed. Because nobody asked Emily. The room fell silent again. I felt my face grow warm. Embarrassed. Uncomfortable. Yet strangely proud. As the meeting ended, one executive stopped beside me. You should be sitting on the other side of the table. I laughed nervously, assuming he was joking. He was not. Later that evening, as I returned to my desk, I noticed something different. People still looked at me. But this time it was not curiosity. It was respect. And for the first time, I began to wonder if Damien had seen something in me long before anyone else did. Saturday arrived faster than I wanted. One moment I was buried in spreadsheets and meeting schedules. The next, I was standing in front of my apartment mirror wondering if it was still possible to fake a sudden illness. The garment bag Damien had arranged arrived that morning. I had argued against it. He ignored every objection. Now the elegant midnight blue gown hung perfectly against the bedroom door, looking far more expensive than anything I had ever worn. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before finally admitting defeat. 2 hours later, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The dress was simple, refined, nothing flashy. My hair fell in soft waves around my shoulders. The only jewelry I wore was a small necklace my mother had given me years ago. Even then, I still felt completely out of place. At exactly 7 o'clock, a black luxury sedan stopped outside my building. My stomach immediately tightened. The driver opened the rear door. Damien was already inside. He looked up from his phone as I entered. For a second, he said nothing. Absolutely nothing. That somehow made me more nervous than any compliment could have. "What?" I asked. A faint smile appeared. "You were worried for no reason." Heat rushed into my face. "That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting." The rest of the drive passed in relative silence. Manhattan glittered outside the windows as the city lights reflected against the glass. When we finally arrived, my confidence disappeared completely. The Black Rose Gala occupied one of the most prestigious hotels in New York. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Photographers stood behind velvet barriers. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in designer gowns moved through the lobby like they belonged there. I definitely did not. Damien stepped from the car and offered his hand. I hesitated only briefly before accepting it. The moment we entered the ballroom, everything changed. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the enormous room. Live music floated through the air. Hundreds of influential guests filled the space. Conversations echoed beneath gold-trimmed ceilings. Then something unexpected happened. The room became quieter. Not instantly. Gradually. One conversation stopped. Then another. Heads turned. More followed. My pulse quickened. "Why is everyone looking?" I whispered. Damien did not answer immediately. His gaze moved across the crowd. Because they finally noticed. That explanation made no sense. Then I saw several expressions shift from curiosity to surprise. One older businessman nearly dropped his champagne glass. A woman standing nearby stared openly. Across the ballroom, another executive looked genuinely stunned. I frowned. None of these people should have known who I was. Yet some of them clearly did. Before I could figure out why, a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. "Well," Victoria Hayes approached with a flawless smile. "This is unexpected." Her eyes moved over me carefully, evaluating, calculating, looking for flaws. "Emily Parker." She tilted her head slightly. I do not think anyone saw this coming. Something in her tone told me the evening was only beginning. And judging by the expressions filling the ballroom, I was not the only person carrying secrets into that room. Victoria's smile never reached her eyes. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was how many people suddenly seemed interested in our conversation. Nearby guests pretended to sip champagne while listening. Others paused mid-conversation. The ballroom had become a stage, and somehow I had ended up at the center of it. "You look lovely," Victoria said. The compliment sounded carefully manufactured. "Thank you. Although I have to admit, I am surprised." "About what?" Her smile widened. "That Damien brought an assistant instead of a date." The remark landed exactly as intended. A few people nearby exchanged glances. I felt the trap immediately. She wanted me uncomfortable, embarrassed, small. For a moment, the old version of me almost appeared. The one who apologized for existing. Then I remembered something Damien had said. "You belong in more places than you realize." "I am surprised too," I replied honestly. Several guests laughed softly. Victoria blinked. She clearly expected defensiveness. "At least you admit it." "Why would I not?" I smiled politely. Being invited somewhere unexpected is not a crime. A few more people smiled. The balance shifted slightly. Victoria noticed. "Still, events like this can be overwhelming." "I imagine they can. Especially for someone unfamiliar with this world." There it was. The real attack hidden beneath perfect manners. Before I could answer, another voice joined the conversation. Unfamiliar. An older gentleman approached from across the ballroom. Silver hair. Distinguished posture. Expensive tuxedo. The moment he arrived, several executives immediately made room for him. That is an interesting choice of words. Victoria's expression changed. Mr. Whitaker. Victoria. He turned toward me. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled warmly. Emily Parker. I stared at him. You know who I am? Of course I do. The surrounding guests grew noticeably quieter. Mr. Whitaker laughed softly at my confusion. You probably do not remember me. Should I? 5 years ago, my company was facing a logistics disaster during a major expansion. My heart skipped. I vaguely remembered working as an unpaid intern during college. Long nights. Endless research. You wrote a proposal. Suddenly I remembered. That was years ago. It saved us millions of dollars. The ballroom seemed to freeze. Victoria's smile disappeared completely. Surely you are mistaken, she said. Mr. Whitaker looked genuinely surprised. Not at all. He turned back toward me. I have actually been hoping to meet you again. My pulse quickened. Why? Because every strategy we implemented came from your recommendations. Silence spread across the room. Complete silence. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. The same people who had looked at me like an outsider only minutes earlier now appeared confused. Curious. Interested. Mr. Whitaker shook his head and smiled. You know what the funny part is? I swallowed nervously. What? Nobody believed a 22-year-old intern came up with those solutions. He laughed. Apparently, they still underestimate you. For the first time that evening, I noticed Victoria looking uncertain. Not angry. Not annoyed. Uncertain. And somehow that was far more revealing. Because it meant the story people believed about me was beginning to crack. And once cracks appear, the truth is never far behind. The atmosphere in the ballroom had changed completely. Less than an hour earlier, people had looked at me with polite curiosity. Now they were looking at me as if they were trying to solve a puzzle. Everywhere I turned, conversations seemed to pause for a moment. Not because of my dress. Not because I arrived with Damien. Because suddenly people were realizing they might not know who I was at all. Mr. Whitaker remained beside me for several minutes, introducing me to executives whose names I recognized from newspapers and financial magazines. Each introduction made me more uncomfortable. I kept waiting for someone to discover a mistake had been made. Instead, the opposite happened. Emily Parker? Another executive asked. You are the analyst who wrote the harbor expansion proposal. I blinked. That project was years ago. It was brilliant. Before I could respond, someone else joined the conversation. Then another. The pattern repeated over and over. Projects I had forgotten. Reports I had written. Strategies I had developed while working behind the scenes. Small contributions that never carried my name publicly, but somehow had reached the people who mattered. I felt overwhelmed. What is happening? I whispered when Damien finally appeared beside me again. His expression remained calm. The truth. The truth about what? About you. I stared at him. You knew this would happen. He did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. My pulse quickened. You planned this. A faint smile touched his face. I invited you. That is not the same thing. No, his blue-gray eyes held mine. It is not. Before I could press further, a voice echoed through the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen. The charity chairman stood on the main stage. Conversations gradually faded. Before tonight's auction begins, there is someone we would like to recognize. I barely paid attention at first. Then I heard my name. My entire body froze. Several years ago, during one of the most difficult periods in our foundation's history, a young consultant provided recommendations that helped save multiple community programs serving thousands of families. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. My heart hammered against my ribs. She never asked for recognition. She never requested credit. In fact, most people never learned her name. I looked toward Damien. He simply watched. Calm. Certain. As if he had known this moment was coming all along. The chairman smiled warmly. Emily Parker, would you please join us? For a second, I could not move. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. The same room that had once made me feel invisible now seemed to be waiting. Slowly, I walked toward the stage. Every step felt unreal. When I reached the microphone, the applause began. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. The kind that comes from respect. Emotion tightened my throat. I looked across the ballroom and saw something I never expected. Victoria Hayes was standing perfectly still. Her expression was not angry. It was stunned. Because the narrative she had believed all evening had completely collapsed. I was not a lucky assistant who happened to receive an invitation. I was someone whose work had quietly shaped outcomes long before anyone bothered to learn my name. And judging by the look in Damien's eyes, this revelation was only the beginning. I stood beneath the lights of the ballroom stage, trying to process what had just happened. The applause had finally faded, but the feeling remained. It was not pride. Not exactly. It was something quieter. The strange realization that people were seeing me for the first time. Not as an assistant. Not as someone standing behind a powerful man. As myself. When I stepped away from the microphone, several guests approached immediately. Executives. Investors. Foundation directors. People who normally would have walked past me without a second glance. Now they wanted to talk. They wanted to ask questions. They wanted to know about projects I had worked on years ago. It felt surreal. One woman in her 60s smiled warmly as she shook my hand. You should have been recognized a long time ago. I thanked her, unsure what else to say. Because the truth was, recognition had never been my goal. I simply liked solving problems. Always had. Across the room, I noticed Victoria standing alone near one of the ballroom windows. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed interested in what she thought. The shift was impossible to miss. Earlier, people had gathered around her. Now they were gathering around conversations she could no longer control. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You handled that well. Damien's voice appeared beside me. I turned toward him. Did I? Most people would have panicked. I laughed softly. I was panicking. A rare smile crossed his face. You hit it. Before I could respond, another man approached us. I recognized him immediately. Richard Coleman, Chief Executive Officer of one of the largest logistics firms in the country. I had seen his interviews on television. Emily. He extended his hand. I have been trying to speak with you all evening. I shook it politely. It is nice to meet you. He laughed. Actually, we met once. My forehead creased. We did. 6 years ago. He smiled. You submitted a consulting recommendation through a junior analyst program. My eyes widened slightly. Another project. Another forgotten chapter. That was a long time ago. It saved my company from a very expensive mistake. I stared at him. You are exaggerating. Not at all. He looked toward Damien. I tried to hire her after that. Now it was my turn to look surprised. What? Richard nodded. Twice. Damien folded his arms calmly. I declined both offers. You never told me that. I know. Richard laughed. I am still annoyed about it. For the first time all evening, I saw something different in the faces around me. It was no longer curiosity. It was respect. Genuine respect. Not because of who invited me. Not because of where I worked. Because of what I had accomplished. And as the conversations continued, I began noticing another pattern. The people who truly mattered in that room already knew my name. They had known it for years. The only people surprised were the ones who had never bothered to look beyond my job title. Suddenly, I understood why Damien had brought me there. He had not invited me so I could enter his world. He had invited me so his world could finally see mine. The evening should have ended there. It would have been the perfect conclusion. Recognition. Respect. Closure. Yet something told me Damien had been leading toward a moment far bigger than any of us realized. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the charity chairman returned to the stage. Guests gradually moved back toward their tables. Conversations softened. Glasses were set down. Attention shifted forward once again. I assumed the program was continuing as planned. Then I heard Damien's name. A ripple moved through the room. Damien rarely spoke at public events. Everyone knew that. He preferred results over speeches, actions over attention, which was why the sight of him walking toward the stage immediately captured every eye in the ballroom. Even I looked surprised. He took the microphone calmly. No notes. No prepared speech. Just the same quiet confidence he carried everywhere. The room fell completely silent. Most people think success belongs to the person standing at the top, he began. His voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. The person whose name appears in headlines. The person sitting in the largest office. A few guests nodded. Damien glanced briefly toward me. That is usually the wrong answer. My heart skipped. The truth is much simpler. He paused. Every successful person has someone they trust when everything becomes difficult. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Someone who solves problems before they become disasters. His gaze remained steady. Someone who notices details everyone else misses. I felt my pulse quicken. Someone who quietly creates opportunities while others take credit for them. The room seemed frozen. For years, people have admired what I built. Damien's expression softened slightly. What they never understood is how many times it almost failed. A few surprised looks appeared around the ballroom. There were negotiations I would have lost, projects I would have abandoned, decisions I would have made incorrectly. He paused again. Then Emily Parker would walk into my office with a better solution. A wave of quiet laughter spread through the room. Warm, genuine, emotional. I could barely breathe. Damien never shared personal details. Never. Yet here he was. Tonight, many of you discovered what I learned years ago. His voice remained calm, but every word landed with remarkable weight. Intelligence does not announce itself. Character does not demand attention. And true value rarely introduces itself when it enters a room. Complete silence followed. The kind that only exists when people are listening with their full attention. Then Damien looked directly at me. Not at the crowd. Not at the executives. At me. Everything people admire about my company became stronger because of her. My eyes immediately filled with tears. The strategies. The solutions. The growth. He shook his head slightly. They did not start with me. The room seemed to hold its breath. Damien's next words changed everything. They started with her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The applause was immediate, powerful, endless. I stood frozen in disbelief as hundreds of people applauded not the man they came to see, but the woman they had almost overlooked. And in that moment, I finally understood that Damien had never brought me there to stand beside his success. He had brought me there so the world could finally recognize my own. 3 months later, life looked remarkably different. Not because my job had changed. Not because my title had changed. In many ways, my daily routine remained exactly the same. I still arrived early. I still carried a notebook everywhere. I still solved problems before most people noticed they existed. The difference was how people saw me. Or maybe the difference was how I finally saw myself. The Monday after the gala, I stepped off the elevator expecting the usual rush of emails and meetings. Instead, I found a small bouquet of flowers waiting on my desk. There was no signature, just a simple card. Thank you for reminding people not to judge by titles. More flowers arrived later that week. Then letters. Then messages from young professionals who said they felt invisible in their own workplaces. I answered every one of them. Because for years, I had felt exactly the same way. One afternoon, several months later, I found myself standing in Damien's office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. He was reviewing documents while I organized the final schedule for the week. Everything felt normal, comfortable, familiar. You are smiling, he said without looking up. Am I? Yes. I glanced toward the window. Maybe I am happy. That finally made him look up. Good. The simplicity of the answer made me laugh. That is all you have to say? Would you prefer a speech? Not from you. A rare smile appeared. The same smile I had once spent months trying to earn. Silence settled comfortably between us. It was the kind of silence that exists only between people who trust each other completely. After a moment, Damien walked toward the window and stood beside me. Below us, the city moved endlessly. Millions of people chasing goals, dreams, and opportunities. Do you know what surprised me most? I asked. What? The recognition was nice. I paused. But that was not the important part. Damien waited. The important part was realizing I never needed anyone's permission to believe in myself. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. Exactly. I turned toward him. You knew that all along, did you not? I hoped you would figure it out. I smiled. That sounds like a very expensive lesson. The gala was expensive. I laughed again. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the city in gold. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the skyline together. Peaceful, certain, earned. Then Damien glanced at me and said something I would never forget. The room was impressed the night you walked in. His expression softened. I was impressed long before that. Emotion tightened my throat. Not because of the compliment, because I finally believed it. As the last light of day stretched across the city, I realized some people change your life by opening doors. Others change your life by showing you that the door was never locked in the first place.